Welcome to another edition of American Countdown. Tonight, resolve the Supreme Court's decision about the protection of employment discrimination for those who are gay or transgender is in fact the right legal decision, even if it's not the political outcome many on the right sought and would like. That's because justices that come from a conservative constitutionalist perspective do not look at what the outcome is and then try to create the legal standard to justify that outcome. They don't see their legal analysis as means to serve a particular ends. They simply apply the law and follow it, even if it leads to a public policy outcome that they dislike politically, even if it leads to a outcome of an individual facts of an individual case that they would prefer not happen. That's because that's what true constitutional jurisprudence requires. And that is, in fact, I think when we look at the analysis, why that was the inescapable analysis, despite its controversy. Trump's justice appointment, Justice Gorsuch, who wrote the opinion, who authored it, was simply following good constitutional legal analysis, even if it did create a political outcome that others didn't like. It also did not mean what a lot of the doomsayers interpreted it to mean. But we'll come back to that a little bit later in the show. Tonight, first starting off with the COVID-19 update, which is suddenly peaking in the news again as they say Trump is going to use the effectiveness of his rallies. All of a sudden, the same press that said mass protests are fine and not a problem for COVID are suddenly saying mass rallies are terrible when they're done for Trump, and that there will just be a suicide pact amongst Trump supporters to even go there and partake or participate. The public interest in Trump's rallies is extraordinary. Almost 1 million people have applied to just go to one event with about 20,000 people in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The desire for Trump to get back out on the road, to reconnect to his audience, to reconnect to his base, to reestablish his appeal in the country, to reestablish his populist message and legacy is at a fever pitch. And the president is right to reignite that part of his rallying base without regard to the various scaremongers that may be out there. And he, in fact, tweeted to that effect today and yesterday. In the same capacity, when we look at the actual COVID-19 data, we don't see evidence that supports what the mainstream media is trying to propagate and push. The scaremongering, aside from having no credibility in the media after they called for a complete mass protest and riots as being completely okay with the pandemic, the actual evidence does not support any of the lockdown logic. It never did. But the evidence continues to mount in that regard. Consider this chart about the number of deaths per day in the UK on a 7-day rolling average since the peak in early April. As we forecast on this show, American Countdown, we predicted that, in fact, what we would see is we would first see a sort of exponential rise in the earliest stages as the virus reached the most vulnerable and susceptible to it. Often these people were over the age of 80, had multiple comorbid conditions, on average at least 3 other deathly diseases, and that made them very vulnerable and susceptible. And COVID was simply changing the time frame and accelerating the time frame of their passing rather than increasing the other numbers of excess deaths over an annualized basis. And then it would flatten out and then would begin to decline precipitously. This is what Professor Levine, this is what other Professor Ioannidis at Stanford, others had been pointing out from the inception. Looking at simply letting the data tell us the story, not the politics misshape and misrepresent the data to tell us a different story. In the same way, good constitutional legal analysis requires following the law, no matter the public policy or case outcome that may happen in any particular instance, so does following the data and the science require following actually the data and the science, not where politics may want to direct you. And in that capacity, what we predicted and what we forecast, and a good way to put a filter on someone's analysis is how accurate they can be at near short-term predictions. If they're really bad at it, that's analysis that you probably shouldn't trust anymore, such as the institutional press. If it continues to have a particular political or polemical angle that has a propaganda effect, then what you're listening to is propaganda, not actually news, not actually data, not actually science, not actually law. Well, in this same context, we forecast that it would flatten and then precipitously decline based on the data, based on the science, based on what Nobel-winning laureate professors were saying. And that is, in fact, what happened in Wuhan. That is what happened in Asia. That is what happened in the Middle East. That is what happened in Europe. And that is what has happened in the United States. And in this chart involving the United Kingdom, where they're still debating whether to reopen or not, while they have riots on the street supported by the media supporting various BLM rioting activities and looting activities and assault activities on the street. Over 27 police officers injured. Statues taken down. They had to do special protection of Winston Churchill statue because these so-called anti-fascists wanted to destroy the statue of the man most responsible for taking out the fascists in World War II. And, well, what does this chart show about the number of deaths per day in the United Kingdom, in the UK? Well, what it shows is exactly what we predicted before it even happened. It had the early exponential rise in end of March, early April. Then it hit a flat line. Then it precipitously declined, and it continues to precipitously decline. There were people who thought, remember the modeler said it would just be a flat curve, and that then you would have a constant, continuous rate of deaths that in the UK they're predicting was going to be 600 a day continually back in April and May. Well, instead, it's all the way down under 200. The number just keeps going down, 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 and that is true across the Western world. There simply is no factual, evidentiary, scientific basis for continuing any form of lockdown. We're probably going to have less than 200,000 deaths in the United States attributed to COVID, and the excess death number will probably be even smaller. In the same capacity, if you look at the Johns Hopkins data chart of the where people have looked at what an actual the rate of testing is, and what you see is the daily positive test. That's the number the media is reporting. And why is that? Because we have the highest number of total testing that we've ever done. So, of course, the number of positive tests is going to go up when you're testing far more people. What you want to look at is the percentage of people testing positive. That's the relevant number. That's the pertinent number. Well, that number is now under 3%. That number has been declining, just as we forecast, since mid-April. It just keeps going down and down and down and down and down and down. So ignore the media trying to hype false information about COVID, fake news information about COVID, trying to make it sound, take the data and twisting it in such a way that it sounds the most problematic. Hospitalization rates are declining, death rates are declining, and the number of people testing positive are declining. And that has been the same now for 2 months, exactly as we forecast, exactly as we predicted. In the same capacity, if we look at another chart that was done by our friend, the ethical scientist, that has his, I think he calls it an attendodemic chart, and he has similar data showing the same, that his predictions have turned out accurate, and showing that currently we're at 3.7% positive test rate. It has just dropped off a cliff since early April, just as we had foreshadowed. And the ethical skeptic, as he's called, you can follow him at the ethical skeptic on Twitter. He details these charts every day. He has them across different states, different time zones, different countries. And he shows that, in fact, the most significant, relevant, pertinent data point, aside from declining deaths, aside from declining ICU rates, aside from declining hospitalizations, is, in fact, the declining positive test rate. So when you're seeing these numbers of tests, more people tested positive, that's only because we are testing at a record level. What you want to know is what percentage of people are testing positive, and more importantly, what degree are people having to get hospital care or facing a deathly risk. That is, in fact, not occurring. What you're having is a lot of younger people getting tested, finding out that they have it, not having any major consequence to it, and that the positive test rate now, almost 97% of people tested negative who actually took the test. And amongst people under 65, recent survey data shows 99.99% survive. That's the survival rate. So there is no major risk. Indeed, if we compare it to Sweden, where they are measuring the death of all causes per week for this flu season over prior years, what they're seeing this year is actually below average for a typical year. So they're seeing a number that's average or below average. So the idea that there was going to be this wave of excess deaths if you didn't lock down has been proven false by the data from Sweden. In the same capacity, they have some test results from TwinCities.com, the Pioneer Press up in Minneapolis. Early test results show few protesters caught COVID-19. Well, of course, that's because going outside, being outdoors, being in the sunshine, being in the heat was never a risk. So the media hypocrisy was exposed by saying go out and protest, go out and loot, go out and riot. But the data always showed, the data always substantiated that there never was any real risk from being outside in the sunshine. You don't need to wear masks. You don't have to worry about social distancing in that context. Your risk was extraordinarily low. Viruses like flu-like viruses simply do not survive in humidity, struggle in heat, don't transmit well outdoors, and were never a major risk anyway for people under the age of 65. And so that's what we're seeing again from additional data. We've now seen a mass experiment. Mass protests. If these mass protests can occur without any explosion of deathly disease, why can't NFL stadiums start reopening and have full-scale tickets and games come late August, early September with preseason and then the regular season? Why can't college football do it? Why can't President Trump have all the rallies he wants to have? There's no longer any logic behind keeping us locked down when we know the data was exaggerated from day one, and we're seeing real live testing. There was no more mass participation in public protests than in the Twin Cities. They already have test results 2 weeks later, and what are they finding? What are they seeing? No major growth rate at all in the deathly rate of the COVID-19. There's simply no longer any factual, empirical, medical, scientific basis for continuing this lockdown nonsense that only jeopardizes the president's reelection and people's economic and material well-being, as well as their psychological and mental health. Indeed, there was a study printed in the Telegraph. The headline is, Inside the Swedish City, that may prove the country's strategy, Sweden's strategy, was right all along, by Richard Orange. In Malmö, Sweden, the coastal city has shown a remarkably different result, with few fatalities and a remarkably low death rate, even though they never, ever locked down. The reality is if you stayed away from certain travel-sensitive communities and constituencies, certain uniquely dense urban populations, and nursing home areas, this disease, the COVID-19, was less threatening than the flu. And that is what the town in Sweden shows, that this coastal city reveals, and the data discusses in this Telegraph article. There simply was no evidentiary basis. We got to see a real live-time experiment in what happened, and various mobility measurements, employment measurements all showed that they, in fact, did not engage in much social distancing at all in that particular area of Sweden or in most of Sweden. And yet they experienced something that was less deadly than an average flu season in Sweden. There was never any basis for shutting down. There was never any basis for locking down. Don't let them try it again next time if a so-called second wave purports to appear, as the media is already trying to push. Meanwhile, the toll that the effect of the lockdown had, both economically and on people's mental, psychological well-being and in terms of life expectancy, the evidence for that continues to grow. As we talked about the risk that when you stick people effectively in a form of isolation, of a social quarantine, when you take away their school, take away their work, take away their participation in public life, take away their participation out in public at public parks and recreation centers and on the beach, the inevitable and inescapable result was going to be devastating damage to the neurological structure of the brain, particularly of children and teenagers, that would never be recoverable, psychological and mental health harm, rises in domestic violence and other forms of mental health problems. Indeed, the life expectancy lost, more and more studies will show and are showing, it far exceeds what damage COVID-19 did, even taking in the inflated numbers that COVID-19 data strategies are actually producing. Take a look at this headline from this article in the Wall Street Journal, The Toll That Isolation Takes on Kids During the Coronavirus Era. As the subheadline reads, playing with peers has important developmental benefits, and doctors worry that children missing out on them now. Indeed, after 6 weeks of lockdown due to COVID-19, they report about how an 11-year-old daughter was starting to suffer from a range of mental health issues that would have continuous and constant effect over time. So indeed, the negative effects of the lockdown are starting to bear fruit, unfortunately. In the same capacity, we have an article from The Hill saying we must learn from the shutdown mistake by Vance Ginn. He explains some of the key reasons why the lockdown cannot reoccur. As the article reads, disruptions caused by fear of COVID-19 and the shutdowns ordered by state and local governments dramatically changed our lives. Indeed, he notes that the lockdowns are responsible for a conservative estimate of between 700,000 lost years of life every month, or about 1.5 million lost life years so far. So, and be given the length of the lockdown ended up being 3 months in many parts of the West, you're talking about 2 million life years being lost. The cost of the shutdown, as the article reports on lost life years, is at least double the number of lost life years from COVID-19. So this takes into consideration that the life expectancy when someone dies who's 20 is more dramatic and effective on life years and life expectancy than someone who's, say, 85 who dies a month or two earlier than expected. So this is how actuarial tables are adjusted. This is how economists look at it. This is how governments, public health officials are supposed to look at it. They're supposed to measure the impact on life in terms of life years lost, not just individual lives lost because of the difference between somebody dying a week early and somebody dying 75 years earlier than expected. And so in that capacity, what we're looking at is something like double, it's probably going to end up being triple or quadruple. Though we lost more life, far more life from the lockdowns and from the panic than will have ever been lost from the pandemic. And some of the most vulnerable people, the poor, working poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, the children who lost school and had psychological damage from what took place, neurological damage from what took place, they're the ones who are going to suffer the most because of the inanity of the insanity of the lockdown. But that doesn't stop the consequences from the lockdown. On the economic side of the equation, we're seeing the same net effect continue unabated. The predictions that we would have an easy, quick, rapid V-shaped recovery that would bounce back and the economy would be back within months of where it was when the shutdowns and lockdowns began is increasingly proven false. The people who advised President Trump that don't worry, the lockdowns won't have any major economic effect, you'll save millions of lives that would otherwise be lost, you must lock down, you must go along with it. President Trump got hoodwinked. He got had. This is what happens when you have advisors that are not behind you, that are not really supporting you, that are probably going to go into the ballot box and vote against you. This is because he's consistently employed the wrong people around him. We see that in John Bolton, neocon warmonger who he never should have hired. He did, caused him problems during the impeachment, and now he's out. Bolton's writing a book, piggybacking off of that short-lived fame, attacking the president. The president at some point has got to take responsibility for who he himself hires. Quit hiring people who worked against you. Quit hiring people who campaigned against you. Quit hiring people who want to see you defeated. Quit hiring people who don't like you, don't share your beliefs, don't have your instincts, and despise the core Trump voter. Quit hiring those people. Quit depending on those people. Quit relying on those people. And then maybe you'll quit making monstrous mistakes like going along with lockdowns that crushed the economy and unleashed these riots. So I think the president has some acknowledgement that that's the net effect of what's happened, and that's why you've heard him say there's no chance he's going to go along with a second lockdown. But the reason why he's in trouble right now, the reason why in the betting markets he's trading at or under 40%, that for the first time in the election season since the president's election in 2016, he is now an underdog to win re-election. Joe Biden is now the favorite. This is entirely the effect of the unemployment losses from the lockdown. When we have real unemployment that may be around 25% if you follow shadow stats online. Shadow stats is a way of tracking data that is consistent with how we used to track it before they changed and shifted it in the 1990s and again in the 2000s to manipulate the data to make it look softer than it is. Well, look at this headline. 24-Hour Fitness files for bankruptcy amid the onslaught of gym closures, according to Bloomberg. Indeed, as Bloomberg reports, 24-Hour Fitness worldwide sought court protection from its creditors, unable to keep up with debt payments after the COVID-19 pandemic. Lockdowns shut down their gyms nationwide. As they noted, it's no guarantee that members will ever come flocking back, and cancellations for the gyms are even more devastating because it costs twice as much to recruit a new member as it does to retain an existing one. Indeed, roughly 28% of gym goers are expected to quit going to the gyms this year. That's the net effect of it. We've instituted cultural changes because of the lockdown logic, also economic impact in terms of what people can practically afford to spend, that's having ripple effects throughout the economy. Indeed, they note that they expect to close down, even with the bankruptcy restructuring, they expect to close down at least 135 club leases they're going to just reject. And they may lose, they said the majority of locations to be closed are in California and Texas. They expect over 8,000 employees, or roughly half of their workforce, may see their time reduced or laid off. That's the net effect of the lockdown logic that was unleashed by the Fauci-Birx crowd. And that's what happens when the world goes in that direction. Now, in the same capacity, CalPERS, one of the biggest pension in the world, reflecting a widespread problem that all pensions have, because you have all these state government and federal pensions that are supposed to return about 7% a year in order to make all the payments they need to make to their aging, retiring workforce, firemen, police officers, government employees, others that are supposed to be protected. Well, the reality is they have not been meeting that 7% for more than a decade now on average. And that's in part because the Fed has deliberately manipulated interest rates to inflate the asset bubble of the stock market, and in order to deal with the government debt that continues to explode. So in order to make that manageable, to make payment on the debt manageable, what the Fed has effectively done is arbitrarily keep interest rates low. That forces pension funds to look for other rates of return because interest rates won't give it to them. And instead, they seek riskier and riskier forms of debt, including corporate bond debt. And in turn, either they have higher risk assets than they're supposed to have as conservative lending institutions, or they're not getting their 7%. Well, guess what CalPERS, the top U.S. pension fund in the country, has said they're going to do? A notoriously corrupt pension fund. And they really leaked this because they want other pension funds to follow suit. Here's the headline from Financial Times. Top U.S. pension fund aims to juice returns via $80 billion leverage plan. That's right. CalPERS is going to go into the leverage business. CalPERS' quote is to move deeper into private equity and private debt by adopting a bold leverage strategy. Indeed, the leverage could be as high as 20% of the value of the entire $400 billion fund. They might put $80 billion plus at risk. What does that mean? That means they could lose 20% overnight because it's now going to be heavily and highly leveraged. Indeed, CalPERS assets represents currently, they're already 30% short of what they need. They only have about 71% of what they need to pay benefits to the 2 million police officers, firefighters, and public workers who they have made promises to pay, who they've taken their money over the years to purportedly invest in it. The estimate is that they have less than a 40% chance of hitting that 7% target over the next decade, which will leave them even shorter. Now, they're already 30% short, and so they need 7% a year just to try to start to catch up to try to meet their obligations. And now they're going to put another 20% at risk. They may be short by 50% if this goes south or sideways. Notably, they noted the stock market slide increased the long-term structural problems across the entire U.S. public pension system with ballooning unfunded liabilities. What that means is they got promises to pay, and they ain't got the cash to pay it. And now they're going to start getting involved in riskier and riskier financial transactions. So you have the most conservative institution by law, by rule in the country, saying they're going to leverage 20% of their total assets to try to catch up. That usually spells debacle and disaster. Indeed, as one analysis from the Naked Capitalist put it, CalPERS plans to blow its brains out, seeks to increase risk by boosting private equity, private debt, and leveraging the entire fund. As the article by Eva Smith details, this is a, quote, fast path to ruin. Indeed, by leveraging the entire fund, they are loading up on risk and engaging in speculative investment. Notably, these speculative investment plans apparently were done in secret and leaked to the Financial Times, because even though the fund is required by law to discuss the matter in public Under the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act of the state of California, CalPERS continues to conspire in secret and never had this meeting or discussion in public. There might be a reason why they didn't do so, just for the same reason they leaked it. They want other pension funds to jump on the bandwagon, so they're going to be less at leveraged exposure and risk in the hopes that they can create a bubble in the stock market to reap the whirlwind rather than reap the tornado that they're likely going to be doing. The article notes that this is turbocharging risk with fund level borrowing. They note that in fact the lockdown has severely damaged entire sectors of the economy. Business travel severely damaged, restaurants severely damaged, gyms, as we just talked about, one of the leading gyms having to go bankrupt, saying that almost half of its employees may never come back, saying that gyms across the country are going to be shut down for good, forfeiting leases on over 100 different gyms across the nation. Live entertainment severely damaged. Various stores severely damaged. Commercial and residential real estate seeing the fallout. Indeed, the commercial real estate company one of the companies that I rent from that has had offices around the world is closing up shop in 30 days for the first time ever. So that is showing real impact. Residential real estate is seeing the impact across the country as there's been a decline of the number of houses put on the market. And in many major cities, they're seeing sudden rises in occupancy rate and sudden interest in people getting out as quickly as possible, likely compounded by the riots and the political response of local governments to those riots. As the article also notes, state and municipal governments have been severely damaged. We'll get into that wreckage a little bit later. They noted that corporations already binged on debt between buybacks and loan-based rescue schemes throughout since 2008 in the last financial crisis. And there's more articles and more people discussing what we've been talking about on this show for months with George Gammon and others. You can follow George Gammon at his YouTube channel where he'll do daily interviews and daily accessible, actionable videos that can help explain some of the economic factors taking place as the Fed's balance sheet skyrockets and almost doubles in 90 days. But as the Fidelity International boss, Ann Richards, explained to the asset management industry, there is a real solvency problem facing multiple businesses on Wall Street and in the business world, something we've been talking about for months. It isn't a liquidity problem. It's not about access to cash. The Fed can print as much of that, and the Treasury can print as much of that as they want with the help of the Fed. The problem is solvency. Debt has been ballooning. We are at record levels of debt at every level of measurement. Consumer, small business, major business, big corporation, Wall Street, pension plans, state governments, federal governments. Everybody has just seen their debt bubble skyrocket in the past 10 years to try to create the illusion of a sustained economy that does not have as its core basis the job building program that is needed that President Trump was starting to have success instituting before he let the lockdown steal it from him. Indeed, the article notes that there are whole industries that may be left completely unable to operate due to their high levels of debt and the lack of access of an injection of capital that will be needed. They also note, the article notes, it took over 20 years for U.S. stocks to get back to their 1929 levels. And the Fed is now announcing the second quarter forecast may be a negative 48.5%. In other words, almost a 50% decline in the second quarter in the United States. That is, as the article says, a probable depression in terms of economic statistics and terminology. Indeed, as they note, virtually all asset classes in the stock market are expensive and the macroeconomic environment is awful. And so it suggests a major problem that CalPERS is going to start to get involved in heavy leverage that puts the biggest pension fund in the country at risk. What happens when CalPERS is 50% short? When CalPERS needs another $200-300 billion to meet its obligations? State of California is either going to come begging to the feds or going to be jacking up taxes like crazy. So while you're living in a California environment increasingly impacted by homelessness, increasingly impacted by rising crime likely to come about from the Ferguson effect of the riots and the BLM defund the police movement popular in major California cities, while you have increasing regulatory dictates from the state on everything possible, conceivable, and imaginable, you're going to have badly underfunded pensions that the state's likely not going to tell their pensioners, hey, we're not going to give you 50 cents on the dollar of what you're entitled to. No, they're more likely to come looking for you, the taxpayer, to foot the difference to make up the bill. Indeed, as one of the commentators to the article noted, bold move is not what you want to hear from your pension administrator. They're supposed to be the conservative of conservative, the green eye shade of green eye shades. In that same capacity, anticipating a rise of bankruptcies, this article from Bloomberg Business section, Delaware is losing its luster as the best place to go broke. It details how there's an ongoing fight in the court system to compete for bankruptcy business. So you have courts anticipating a surge and wave of bankruptcies and courts competing to be the best court to come to because it will impact and influence their local legal marketplace and give the local court system extraordinary power and influence. The article notes that experts say, could be the biggest wave of corporate failures in recent memory is what's coming due to the lockdown economics and the underlying structural problems exacerbated by that lockdown. Indeed, they said traditionally corporations preferred New York and Delaware because the judges in those courts tended to favor corporations over unions, over retirees, and over smaller creditors. In other words, the big banks and the big businesses were the ones that the bankruptcy courts of New York and Delaware tended to tend to. I personally experienced that professionally in dealing with a Delaware bankruptcy judge in a CalPERS case where CalPERS had defrauded the people of the state of California of almost $1 billion with the help of a lot of Democratic political allies, and now have had to appeal the case all the way up to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals to try to get some justice because there wasn't any in the Delaware bankruptcy court. Indeed, they say now the corporations are, quote, looking for an edge, which typically comes from being able to guess how a court will rule. And for that, they want judges who are predictable, judges who handled a large number of cases. And that's why there are judges actually competing to get these more bankruptcy business. But it tells you something about where the economic structure is, that judges and courts focus is where can they get the most bankruptcy business. That's not the sign of a burgeoning economy ready to just take off. And indeed, if we take a look at another indicator of this, a chart, that's the Fed balance sheet versus Treasury debt, what we see is that almost all of the Treasury debt appears to have been bought by the Fed. That means, there have been trillions and trillions of dollars of new debt issued just in the last several months to fund all of the various stimulus packages, to like the CARES Act and the rest, and the Paycheck Protection Program, just to deal with the lockdown effects of all these crazy governors and mayors across the country in response to an exaggerated risk of COVID-19. But what this chart is showing is that there are almost no purchasers in the open public marketplace, not governments, not corporations, not individuals, for purchasing this Treasury debt. It appears that the Fed had to be the primary purchaser. That, too, is a bad indicator over the long haul. Meanwhile, over the past couple of months, one of the reasons for this strange stock market resurgence when the real economy was tanking was because more and more people took their excess cash from their stimulus checks or excess money from their that they had saved up or excess money that was from their unemployment paying more than their employment paid for. And rather than spend it out in the consumer economy that could create real jobs, they decided to go to a site called Robinhood. Robinhood is a new sort of app, a new program designed for ordinary people to access the stock market. So you had a bunch of ordinary, everyday people making between $30,000 and $80,000 a year, taking their $3,000 extra combined stimulus checks and savings and putting it all in the market suddenly because they thought they could trade it with Robinhood, and it may have been a principal reason for the surge in the stock market. They may now put them at great risk and exposure. Indeed, Robinhood calls it investing for everyone. Robinhood, a pioneer of commission-free investing, gives you more ways to make your money work harder. That you can break free from commission fees and all of this dynamic, and basically it increased the number of everyday, ordinary, small-scale day traders. People that had a job now decided to become day traders instead, like the guy at Barstool Sports was bragging about. Well, one of the places they were investing heavily in was Hertz, even after Hertz declared bankruptcy. Well, that may not turn out so good. Look at this headline from Yahoo News and from Bloomberg. Hertz warns stock buyers will need miracle to avoid wipeout. That's right. Hertz's Global Holdings warned prospective new stock investors. That's all these people who took their stimulus checks and put it on Robinhood and put it in the stock market, and a whole bunch of them bought Hertz stock. Well, guess what? If they'd been listening to this show, they would have known not to do that. If they'd listened to the George Gammons of the world, they would have known not to do that. But they were paying attention and thought they could play day trader like anyone else. And what it said was Hertz Global Holdings warned prospective new stock investors they're all but certain to be wiped out as the car renter proceeds with a share sale in the middle of its bankruptcy, noting that they're going to have to pay back with common stock all of its bondholders. They have problems with a wide range of creditors, and they're likely going to leave a big fat zero, zilch, zunka, nada for the people who went buying thinking that the stock market was going to boom like it was 1929 Berlin or New York. So the same effect has happened, and that may have another devastating impact on a lot of your ordinary income, middle-income families that made the mistake of trying to gamble on the market. Of note, well, if you want to get something cheaper, the used vehicle market might be a place to do so, because as this same article details, Hertz has been dumping a lot of its vehicles into the used vehicle market. They say the used vehicle market makes the company's job of satisfying creditors tougher. Why? Because vehicle prices are way down from last year. On average, about almost a 50% discount you can get right now on some used cars, because that's what Hertz is having to dump it at, even when it has the wholesale leverage power that it has. In the same unsettling capacity, there is this article from Bloomberg Law. 1/3 of U.S. job losses are at risk of becoming permanent. That's the headline. 1/3 of the job losses over the last several months, and remember that's close to 40 million, are at risk of becoming permanent. In other words, they're talking about more than 10 million jobs may have been permanently lost thanks to this lockdown. As this one guy describes it, my job stopped, but the bills don't. Indeed, the article goes into detail, has some charts that are useful, and it talks about a reallocation shock in which firms and even entire sectors of the economy suffer lasting damage from the lockdown. Indeed, U.S. central bankers, the Fed, along with state central bankers around the world, forecast leaving interest rates in the United States near zero for the next 2 years due to an anticipated surge in unemployment that is the highest continuous level since the Great Depression. Remember, we forecast that the likely economic effect of these lockdowns was going to be inducing depression-level unemployment. Now we're witnessing it. Now we're seeing it. Now we're living it. In the same capacity, new research by Bloomberg Economics shows that 30% of U.S. job losses from February to May are a reallocation shock where those jobs are unlikely to return. Indeed, the data suggests that there'll be an initial quick recovery, like we've seen in the end of May, for some portion of the employment market, but then it will level off with millions still unemployed. Something like after what happened in 2008 might be about to reoccur, where we're in effectively almost depression-level economics that's only hidden because of how the government manipulates inflation-related stats and data. Indeed, they're noting that jobs in the hospitality industry, retail, leisure may have disappeared completely due to the restructuring that occurred. Wholesale and retail have taken major hits. Manufacturing may bounce back, but it has taken a hit. Transportation has taken a real hit. Airlines are still struggling to even have 10% of the same airlines, the same travel, the same daily flights they had before. Research published in May by the Becker-Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago estimates 40% of the layoffs will be permanent, according to the Bloomberg article. So anywhere from 1/3 to 40% plus are never going to come back. And if you look at the trading that's taking place in the stock markets, that's consistent with that. They note that the way in which the markets are trading and not trading in certain industries suggests that half of the U.S. job losses came from the lockdown, 30% were from reallocation that are unlikely to return, and 20% were due to unemployment benefits encouraging people to stay home rather than work because you got effectively an unemployment bonus of about $600 a week for a period of time. And so what we're seeing is that many of these jobs may not come back, period. And that is the effect of the lockdown logic that just thought you could turn off and on an economy like it was a car engine. In the same capacity, let's look at, aside from the impact on state pension funds, let's look at the impact on state treasuries. In an economics article entitled The Fiscal Cost of COVID-19, Evidence from the States by Christos Makridis and Robert McNabb, says that due to the rise in unemployment in the states, you've seen also, and due to the economic shutdown and likely the continued economic harm of the lockdown, of its derivative effect even after reopening, they anticipate large losses among sales tax revenue, individual income tax revenue, corporate income tax revenue. They additionally note if there's a decline in home sales or a decline in home prices, that will have an impact on local property tax revenues. They estimate that the average state, just the average state, remember 8 states didn't lock down at all, another 20 states only did a more limited lockdown in terms of either temporarily, in terms of time, or in terms of the scope and scale of the lockdown. They noted that the average state will experience at least a 20% decline in tax revenues, $60 billion nationally in ordinary prices. That's just the average. There's going to be some with much greater. They note the economic consequences of the lockdown, what they call the various forms of non-pharmaceutical interventions, have been severe indeed. They also note that customer demand, business investment, employment, consumer expectations, business expectations continue to be depressed compared to pre-COVID Trump peak levels. Consumer demand down, business investment down, employment down, consumer expectations down, business expectations down, all of it down and depressed, even as some of the states and local governments begin to relax the non-pharmaceutical interventions and open up. And where are the governments going to get those funds? They note that their estimates suggest the average state will have at least 20% lower revenues as a result of just the employment declines. This translates to a decline of about $1.25 billion for the average state, or more than $63 billion nationally in 2012 prices. So if we go to contemporary price, it'd be even higher. They noted the synchronized economic shock across states inflicted the kind of harm that is going to be very difficult to recover from. Most likely, given also the pension collapse that's occurring, where are these states going to go? And then you add to that all the riots, all the looting, all the burning, all the arson. And if they're going to defund the police, that's going to lead to more spikes in crime. Where are they going to get the money for that? Minneapolis alone said they needed $55 million. So you're going to have billions and billions of dollars they're going to be begging for relief for pension funds, billions and billions of dollars from riot relief, billions and billions of dollars from their own lockdowns. All of this due to their own bad policies and over the past decade plus. Are the feds going to bail them out? If they don't, what are they going to do? Are people going to move en masse from those states to other states? Are we going to have a real live Escape from New York, the old movie from the 80s? Is that going to look like New York City again? We shall see. In the same capacity, there's an article about the past 3 months proved it. The cost of lockdown on the economy, on the social, health, and educational structures of the people are far too high. Indeed, the headline of the article, from The Guardian no less. So here you have a left-leaning Guardian finally admitting and acknowledging what we have been saying for months, what others have said now repeatedly, such as Peter Hitchens in the UK and elsewhere. The past 3 months have proved it. This is the headline. The cost of lockdown are too high, as Larry Elliott reports. He says governments now know the economic fallout, the social fallout, the health fallout, the educational fallout, and how they scar the public populace too deeply to ever repeat again. Indeed, the article talks about how lockdowns are toxic, how the economy in the United Kingdom has shrunk by at least 25%, how it's become clear that there is no such thing as the science when it comes to COVID-19, given the differing views amongst immunologists, virologists, and epidemiologists about infection rates, possible mortality outcomes. In much the same way, the article notes that monetarists and Keynesians differ over economics. These so-called scientists have deeply differed over the scope, scale, direction, forecast, future of COVID-19. To such a degree that we should never defer public policy to the white lab coats again to engage in a modern-day Milgram experiment of us as if we're lab rats. Indeed, as the article goes through the harmful side effects of the lockdown, numbers of suicides way up, domestic violence way up, mental health problems way up, unemployment way up. Jobless total in general over the long-term future could reach a third of the workforce, as the government is currently paying that many in the United Kingdom. They note how it's deepened Britain's class, ethnic, gender, generational divides, likely helping to trigger some of this looting and rioting and arson that's taking place. They noted the school closures have been brutally effective on children, especially from poorer households, in both their economic and educational progress, but also their neurological development. So there's no question that the economic effects of COVID-19 lockdown have been devastating. But Elon Musk has a solution for us. If we go to the Daily Sun, the headline reads, Elon Musk, a year away from creating the $6 million man through implanted chips. That's right, billionaire Elon Musk says the chips will be implanted in human brains. He says, don't worry, it's all going to be good. It will allow paralyzed people to walk again. It'll be just like that 1970s cult TV show with Lee Majors, the $6 Million Man. Surely you won't mind a device being implanted in your skull. There's going to be electrode threads inserted carefully into your brain, and you won't even know that somebody has it. It can interface anywhere in the brain. I wonder how that will work with Bill Gates' idea for remote control vaccines. Will there be remote control chips in your brain? What used to be dystopian fantasy is increasingly billionaire reality. That may be that reality for all of us in the not far off future. But of course, that didn't stop the riots from continuing to occur. As Rasmussen reports, 40% of Republicans now think a civil war is likely. They think the United States will experience a second civil war sometime in the next 5 years. That's the headline of the Rasmussen article. 40% of GOP voters think civil war likely. That is where we are in terms of mindset and mentality over what people have witnessed over the past 3 weeks. It is getting so bad that you have people like liberal Andrew Sullivan, who writes for New York Magazine, with a headline that's actually titled, Is There Still Room for Debate? Noting that this white silence equals violence gibberish is meant to be a totalitarian mindset out of something like from the Soviet-era days of Eastern Europe. He even cites Václav Havel's essay, The Power of the Powerless. And his point was, what Havel's point was, what Sullivan's point is, it's the dilemma of living in a world where adherence to a particular ideology becomes mandatory. As the article describes it, it's a combination of tired slogans and abusive language enforced brutally by the state, its spies, and its informers. Noting how much of that is effectively happening with the cultural hegemonic influence the left has had over social media, over Hollywood, over television, over news media in general, over academia, over many human relations departments of major corporations, advertising departments of major corporations. It's a popular front strategy that is meant to infiltrate the public mind and effectively control what ideas you're allowed to think, what ideas you're allowed to see, what ideas you're allowed to speak. And he notes how dangerous this scarlet letter society is. This return of Victorian witchcraft hunting really is. He describes it as, quote, a liberal system that the left, here's how he describes what the left thinks. The left thinks, this new radical left, this new left, the last new left was from the late 1960s. We have another new left in the modern age, very much tutored under the radical professors and teachers in public universities and institutions of the kind we saw at Evergreen College. We saw the first preview of it when the attacks on Brett Weinstein, who was himself a left-leaning professor who just simply believed in tolerance, openness, debate, ideas, and discussions, and that made him a criminal in their world. The same way that left-leaning or moderate types like Dave Rubin or Tim Pool have been the subject of brutal attack, either physically or on the social media space for shaming and censorship campaigns. He says they really believe, this is what the New Left believes, according to Andrew Sullivan, and it's a pretty good depiction. Quote, the liberal system is itself a form of white supremacy, which is why racial inequality endures and why liberalism's core values and institutions cannot be reformed, but can only be dismantled. Indeed, it's the revolutionary, insurrectionary logic of the radical New Left who believes that we must just defund the police, not reform the police. We must destroy America, not restructure America. Indeed, it has evidence of dogmatism, intolerance. As Sullivan describes it, quote, there's no liberal space in this revolutionary movement for genuine, respectful disagreement, regardless of one's identity or even one's open-minded exploration. In fact, as he puts it, quote, there is an increasingly ferocious campaign to quell dissent, to chill debate, to purge those who ask questions, and to ruin people who do not swallow their reductionist ideology whole. This action, he calls it suppressing, shaming, censoring, anything that is, quote, counter to their view. Indeed, they consider opposing views to be a form of violence against the oppressed that justifies their, quote, self-defense. In other words, their self-defense against people with the wrong think, and thus can be violently assaulted in the name of, quote, self-defense. This is the lunacy of the logic of the New Left, as Sullivan himself, who is on the left, details. He says it is, quote, very reminiscent of totalitarian states where you have to compete to broadcast your fealty to the cause. Think about the Soviet Union. Think about Mao's China and the Cultural Revolution. Think about today's North Korea and how people try to compete in the crowd to say, no, I worship you more, dear leader. I worship you more. This is the same mindset and mentality infecting the New Left that they are demanding on the rest of us. Indeed, as Sullivan himself concedes, it's a cultishness of the New Left. They're even demanding cutting off contact with your own families if you don't awaken and see the truth and repeat their formulae. Indeed, public apologies are not enough, but they are the beginning. You must have individuals issue public apologies, just like Mao's Cultural Revolution, to their previous life and resolve to do the work, to actively dismantle the quote-unquote structures of oppression. Study where this lunacy led the shining path in Bolivia. Watch a movie like Dancer Upstairs and see just how craziness it is, where they're consuming the pages from their own Bible they were taught as a kid from a priest who took care of them after they execute the priest in the name of destroying the structures of oppression. This is the dangerousness of this diseased idea, the real virus that wants to infect our civil society and destroy our core liberties. Indeed, it is not enough, as he says, for you to display your virtue to your customers and your clients, because even then you might not be left alone. Every single aspect of life, every word you speak or write, every tweet you might have ever sent, every private conversation you may have ever had or have in the future, any email you might send or have sent, every friend you've ever cared for is a function of your racism or anti-racism. On which side are you? Are you pure? Have you been purged? And what will this result in, as he himself, Sullivan, details? Brutal public shamings, brutal public outings, brutal public inquisitions for this new cultural revolution of the new left. Indeed, as he points out, while there is no secret police, this evangelist doctrine of BLM desires to impose penalties for those and weaponize the workforce to purge anyone who does not share the ideology or repeat the quote, like you're in communist Czechoslovakia, and as Havel described in his book, The Power of the Powerless. You may be demoted, you may be fired, you may be excluded, you may be exempted, you may be just shamed or censored, you may be humiliated. Some part of your life will be ruined if you do not obey, if you do not say what we tell you to say. As he properly closes the article, President John Kennedy once wisely said, quote, For a nation that is afraid to let its people judge the truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that is afraid of its people. And that is the core of anti-democratic institutions. Indeed, BLM might chant power to the people, but they really mean power to themselves over the people. And that is why they must be resisted at all times. Indeed, some are bravely doing exactly that. An anonymous Berkeley minority professor attacked BLM's narrative. Indeed, the headline from Zero Hedge is, "Anonymous Berkeley Professor Shreds BLM Injustice Narrative." Berkeley tries to pretend that they have no idea who this is, and they pray that it couldn't possibly be one of them, but other professors in academia have confirmed that it is, in fact, someone from those departments. Indeed, as the article reads, "Dear Berkeley history professors, dear professors X, Y, and Z, I am one of your colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley." He goes through and he is concerned about, quote, the absence of diversity of opinion. He notes that both Professor Thomas Sowell and Wilfred Riley have put a lie to the BLM myth and narrative. In fact, other professors like Glenn Loury and others have made the same points. He notes, quote, intelligent scholars reject a narrative that strips black people of agency and systematically externalizes the problem of the black community onto outsiders, unquote. Indeed, that conforms to what psychologists have long studied. The key for working class people bridging the gap to having more economic power and independence and political power and independence and social status and prestige in their lives is that they have an inner loci of control. They believe that they are the masters of their own fate. They are the captains of their own destiny. This was a key to Nelson Mandela's understanding and kept his mind sane while locked up during the South African political resistance movement that ultimately led to him being president of the country. He was someone who believed that he could control his fate. He could control his destiny. The agency was his. He did not say, he refused to be a victim. He saw himself as someone who, while on the outside may be a captive, on the inside he was free. To paraphrase the U2 song, Silver and Gold, that was about exactly that mindset and mentality of Mandela. King had the same approach, Martin Luther King. Malcolm X had a similar approach. And in fact, anyone of a successful insurrection for political change for the good had that same approach. As the article goes on to note, black people are not incarcerated at higher rates than involvement in violent crime would predict. Moreover, the immigration story puts a lie to the racial narrative that if the current racism explains the position of the African American community rather than the Democratic Party imposing institutional policies that keep the African American community dependent upon them for perceived political protection and economic empowerment. If that's the true narrative, and rather than racism as the explanation for the circumstances that exist today, noting that Asian Americans, Indian Americans, and critically Nigerian Americans, this would also apply to Jamaican Americans, are incarcerated at a vastly lower rate and have far more economic success than white Native Americans do. So if racism is the problem, why are Nigerians more successful in America than white natives are? That can't, how can color bias explain that? How can redlining explain that? How can discrimination in employment or by grants or by admissions in colleges or universities or schools or access to capital, how can, if it's all being racially based discrimination, white supremacy logic, then why are the white Native Americans inferior economically and by almost every social status measurement to Asian Americans, Indian Americans, and Nigerian Americans and Jamaican Americans? How can that be explained? Race and color simply does not explain the data. Again, if we just let the law tell us where to go, no matter the political outcome, if we just let the facts and the data and the science tell us where to go, regardless of the political outcome, it refutes the institutional media's narrative. It refutes Black Lives Matter's narrative. It refutes the neo-Marxist agenda. Because the data simply doesn't back it up. The data simply doesn't support it. That's why they don't talk about the data much at BLM. That's why they don't have specific reform measurements ideas beyond destroying the system, destroying the statutes, tearing things down, wrecking things, defunding the police, etc. Indeed, As this open letter from this anonymous Berkeley professor goes on to note, the message from BLM is clear. Black lives only matter when whites take them, noting that, in fact, the issue of crime continues to be a major risk point for the ordinary lives of most black Americans, not a white cop. In the same capacity, he notes that the funds that are going into BLM appear to be redirected to, quote, Act Blue charities. In other words, donating to BLM today is to donate tomorrow to Joe Biden's 2020 campaign. That suggests a movement that's not about institutional reform, but is about political partisan agenda seeking. Indeed, as the article goes on to note, this mindset of Democratic leaders now for 2 generations, quote, will all but guarantee a perpetual state of misery, resentment, poverty, and the attendant grievance politics, servicing affecting the African American community to service the Democratic Party. He notes there are virtually no avenues for dissent in academic circles. That's why his letter had to be anonymous. But he sees the BLM narrative as making us all, quote, useful idiots of the wealthiest classes, carrying water for the Jeff Bezos of the world and the modern-day slavers, like the Chinese companies employing young children in slave labor throughout China to make 2/3 to 75% of American products. Indeed, he points out that Martin Luther King would probably be attacked if he dared to try to speak at a BLM rally or on a college campus today. He wrote this as a person of color who's offended by what he calls the soft bigotry of low expectations. He's offended by the psychologically devastating impact, this bogus goodwill, this dependent mindset, this you're a victim, you're weak, you're incompetent, you can't defend yourself, you can't protect yourself, you can't enhance yourself unless we, white liberals, come and give you handouts from guilt-ridden whites. He's tired of that narrative because he sees it as an offensive narrative that undermines the independence, the entrepreneurialism, the creativity of the African American community, and is being done to service the interest of this Munchausen syndrome, white left, white liberals who simply want to elevate themselves on the backs of black men, not to promote them, not to protect them, but to use them. It is a wise and sage article, well worth looking at Zero Hedge. Meanwhile, of course, the agenda of defunding of the police continues to spread and pervade. Ilhan Omar is talking about it. City of San Francisco is talking about it. City of Minneapolis is talking about it. But some truckers are starting to push back. According to this headline article, defunding of police could lead to truckers refusing to deliver. Truckers have no interest in getting in the middle of being another Reginald Denny ripped out of their cab and beaten like a pulp on national TV with the latest riot and latest looting. They're not going that direction. They're often the targets of criminal organizations, often the target of criminal opportunists. They have no desire to re-experience that life. So they're making clear if you want trucks to deliver to your city, you better have adequate policing in that city. So we're seeing some of the pushback in that respect. Meanwhile, another form of pushback is all these affluent folks who say they really want all this change to occur. Well, luxury real estate demand is surging in places outside of New York City, outside of San Francisco, outside of Chicago. Indeed, it's surging in Aspen and Park City, Utah. In other words, lily white places. So that's what you're seeing happen in the real world in response to this, and that is exactly what happened after the riots of the late 1960s. There was mass capital flight, mass white flight from cities like Newark, New York, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New York City, Chicago, Illinois, Buffalo, New York, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Los Angeles, California, even San Francisco. Go back and look at what the films looked like in San Francisco, like films like Death Wish or the Dirty Harry films. They were not the San Francisco you know today. As the sort of romantic locale of gorgeous vistas and beautiful homes. So that's happening again. History repeats itself more often than it doesn't. Meanwhile, they're witnessing the kind of insanity of these kind of protests, even in Olympia, Washington, where the headline from this article is Olympia mayor's home downtown vandalized during Friday night protest. Indeed, they have people going around doing every form of vandalism known to man, other forms of looting and robbing, and the locals again complaining that this is really not about the civil rights and civil liberties they claim to be marching for. Notably, actual data, if you look at the chart from New York City that was published by the Office of the New York City Comptroller, shows that police misconduct claims fell to a 10-year low last year in New York City. The lowest rate of claims, in fact, one of the lowest rate of claims they've ever had in settlement amounts, number of settlements, claims filed, lawsuits adjudicated. New York City was doing better than ever. And yet you have people getting together to try to burn police cars with police in them. Indeed, that sort of approach, that sort of mindset, that sort of mentality really tells us something about the case. One case to really continually study, survey, and consider is the New York City case, where you had two lawyers and a career criminal activist conspiring to firebomb police cars with police in them. And then one of those lawyers was bailed out by a high-ranking Obama intelligence official. And then the person defending them in the New York Times, calling for defunding the police, was a Soros Civil Justice Fellowship Award winner just a few years ago. If you dig in, you're going to start to see a common pattern. See who funds BLM. Just type BLM and George Soros. See what pops up. Search how many people George Soros was putting into prosecutors' positions who are now refusing to prosecute people who are rioting and looting in places like New York and Philadelphia, San Francisco, and St. Louis. Just look at George Soros funding prosecutorial campaigns of 2018. But that case in New York, we have these two lawyers planning the firebombing. One of them a well-respected corporate lawyer, the other one with a high prestigious pedigree. One of them was had political power, sat on a city council board in Brooklyn. Their connections to Obama officials, intelligence officials, helping to bail them out. The connections therein to a career criminal who'd been arrested in 11 different states for various forms of Antifa-type criminality on a consistent basis. And then connect them to sort of a modern second incarnation of the Weather Underground from the early 1970s. Study and read about them, because they will give you some of the previews, some of the prologue for what is taking place. And indeed, the response. In fact, a good article about it is printed in the New York Post called "3 Indicted for Allegedly Throwing Molotov Cocktails at NYPD Vehicles Face Life in Prison." They note that one of the key people, who's from Catskill, who was not the lawyer, she was the career criminal, was hurling the makeshift explosive at an NYPD vehicle occupied by 4 police officers. She tried to burn up and explode a cop car with 4 cops in it and burn them alive. She was co-conspiring with 2 other people who are now facing potential life imprisonment, who were well-degreed, pedigreed corporate law types with big reputations from big law schools. What does that tell you about what's being taught in law schools? What does that tell you about the connection? I mean, one was on furlough from Pryor Cashman, a very well-respected law firm in New York, and was a member of Brooklyn's Community Board 5. And so those are and another one was bailed out by a high-ranking Obama ex-intelligence official. So who's really involved in some of these rioting and looting? Why do we not yet have an explanation for all these pallets of bricks that have been popping up all across the country, with this mysterious white vans showing up and being briefly photographed, fleeing the scene of where the pallets of bricks were loaded up right near a protest so that the protest could turn easily violent? Why don't we have more intel and information about that? Well, New York City's reaction is to flee. As this headline article reads from the Wall Street Journal, the housing market around New York City is booming. Real estate agents say home shoppers looking to buy outside the city. Now, of course, leave it to the media to say, oh, this is probably pandemic or the lockdown. You dig into it, no, this started happening after the riots and the looting. The riots and the looting made it clear to people, we got to get the heck out of here. This is insanity. That's exactly what happened after the last set of rioting and looting in the late 1960s. So do not be surprised if history repeats itself. Meanwhile, the sort of whole cultural mindset of silence is violence, that sort of inanity and insanity, if you're not with us, you're a threat to us, and now we can come beat you up and take your job and take everything else from you, shame you, censor you, try to control you, try to dictate how you think, just like sort of Soviet era, Mao era world's view, just like North Korea today. Professor William Jacobson, a well-regarded law professor from Cornell, is quoted in this Breitbart article. Professor William Jacobson, silence as violence is totalitarian, just like the USSR. Notes that this is a dangerous legal concept, that it's a form of kind of bloodletting and wilding in the cultural and political scene. He notes that the people who founded Black Lives Matter are basically Marxist and extreme radical leftists whose goal is to tear down our society. He notes that this is a particularly dangerous time to be an academic or to be on campus. So he is now repeating what we've been talking about on this show for several weeks, refuting the sort of established recommendation. And indeed, we've seen that across the board as more statutes defaced, more statutes torn down, including Thomas Jefferson's statute in Portland, including a prominent Quaker abolitionist. They put BLM and a whole bunch of other things, defamed his face, destroyed everything about him. They're like, man, there's a statue, that guy, that's got to be like somehow totalitarian or oppressive or white power or white supremacy. Well, someone who fought his whole life to end slavery. That's the kind of people they did it. Remember, they did it to the Shaw Memorial, the memorial to the 54th Unit in Massachusetts, which was the first ever black unit to fight to literally end slavery, got defaced by these Antifa types. Not only that, they defaced a memorial that was dedicated to a lynching victim, the lynching of Levi Harrington. They actually went in Kansas City. They went in and defaced and damaged that. Part of the Equal Justice Initiative. That's why it exists. And they're now defacing memorials meant for victims of these kind of things. Meanwhile, we have additional parts of additional polling information that we'll get into, but as well additional reports of more and more federal prosecutions against these Antifa types by Attorney General Barr. People being prosecuted for a wide range of actions. This includes, it's being reported by a wide range of sources. This includes a person in North Carolina for possession of destructive device, another case out of the Southern District of California for possession of a destructive device, Western District of Wisconsin for aiming a laser pointer at an aircraft. We saw the same thing happening in California, the same thing happening in Portland, the same thing happening in other cities across the country, aiming a laser pointer, trying to cause problems for the person in the helicopter that can often cause crashes. That's what these people are up to. In the Middle District of Louisiana, 3 Baton Rouge residents face federal arson charges in connection with deliberate politically motivated arson. More arson charges in Minnesota for destroying a health and nutrition store in St. Paul. My brother, a philosophy professor who lived in St. Paul for a long time and was shocked at the devastating damage done to so many blue-collar parts of the city and other entrepreneurial parts of the city, many of which, by the way, lean left politically. Felons in possession of firearms that were involved in various rioting activities in Philadelphia, charged in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. More charges in the Northern District of Alabama with people smashing police car windows during protests, and that's in Birmingham. In Minnesota, additional charges for people aiding and abetting the arson at the Minneapolis Police Department's 3rd Precinct. Western District of Texas, more charges against people who brought destructive devices in Austin, possession of destructive devices that were basically bombs. Northern District of Texas, more threats of people who are engaged in theft and other crimes during the protest in violation of various federal criminal laws as relevant or applicable there. And remember, there's a riot act in the federal criminal context that can expand liability, criminal liability. Additionally, more charges for arson in Tacoma, Washington for setting fire on police vehicles in Seattle. Charges out of the Southern District of California for possession of stolen firearms, burglary of federally licensed. They went into a gun store and robbed a gun store owner. A whole bunch of them did. And stole the guns from there to commit further crimes later. A conspiracy to commit bank theft, to steal from various ATMs, which was happening across the country. These charges happened in the Northern District of Illinois. But those stealing ATMs was a nationwide phenomenon, almost anywhere where, quote-unquote, peaceable protests were occurring. Charges in Delaware for an individual smashing police car windows. The Middle District of Florida, more federal charges for Molotov cocktails at various protest events. In Minnesota, more charges for civil disorder, rioting, arson, looting that involves violations of the Federal Riot Act and other criminal laws. Charges out of the pointing of lasers at police helicopters in other cities and jurisdictions across the country. So for people having bombs, people doing raiding and looting, people doing a wide range of arson behavior, There's been over 75 federal criminal prosecutions. It will probably set a record for the most federal criminal prosecutions in the widest expanse part of the country and the nation in American history from what has taken place here. In the same capacity, we should talk about the polling data and what people really believe and don't believe about defunding the police. So we have the Huffington Post and YouGov did a poll of 1,000 Americans at the peak of all of these protests. And what they found was that even at the peak of these protests, even with the most public support for these protests, even with the press pushing this message, only 27% of Americans support defunding the police. And if you change that to abolishing the police, the number drops to single digits. So even when you're, say, just cutting funding effectively to the police, 73% of the country is not on board. What's interesting is who is on board. If you look at it, if you look at white, self-described liberals with a post-college degree who are millennials or Generation Z, only that group of people do you find a majority of people supporting defunding the police. Amongst African Americans, only 29% support defunding the police. 71% oppose it, almost the same as white Americans. Indeed, if you look at people without working class people, so if you factor out self-described liberal post-college degree young black voters, they're almost exactly the same and even more conservative and more pro-funding of the police than most white people are. So this illusion that there's this big demand, what you're seeing is, again, like the late 1960s, it was a cultural revolution that was really a class revolution by the elites against the people. The reason why 1968 protests backfired against the left. So what happened is you had all these anti-war protesters took over in 1968 in the city of Chicago to protest the Democratic National Convention because they didn't like Mayor Daley. They did not like Hubert Humphrey. They were opposed to Lyndon Baines Johnson. Their candidate, Robert Kennedy, had been shot and assassinated not long before. Martin Luther King had been shot and assassinated not long before Malcolm X would be assassinated. So many of their political leaders were gone, and so the more radical components took over. But the people present were overwhelmingly upper middle class kids. So when they were chanting off the pigs, and they were chanting pigs eat, you can guess the last word, with chanting right at them with the little, the top of garbage cans, banging on those right across from the police, Chicago police. And the Chicago police just sort of went nuts on them, beat the daylights out of them. To their surprise, much of the public sided with the police. And the reason was because working class people saw this as upper middle class kids spitting on them, spitting on their kids when they came home from Vietnam, spitting on them for being pro-flag, pro-America, spitting on them for their family that's cops or policemen, spitting on them for their cultural values in general, for being conservative, for believing in family, for believing in kids, for believing in church, for believing in institutions. They were being mocked, satirized, criticized, ridiculed. And because it became a class conflict, what was a broad-scale opposition to the Vietnam War ended up becoming less oriented to opposing the Vietnam War, as the Hard Hats and the Harley Angel and the Hells Angels both ended up joining police in attacking protesters in the famous Hard Hat protest of or the Hard Hat riots, as they sometimes call them, on Wall Street in New York a year or two later. The same in Oakland with the Hells Angels and siding with the police against the local protesters. It's because these were snobs. These were upper middle class kids whose ideas were rooted in Marxist ideology that were anti-American, anti-tradition, anti-conservative. They did not root their ideas in universalism. They rooted them in identitarianism. And because of that, there was a massive political backlash by ordinary people who might have been otherwise ideological or political allies who wanted nothing to do with them. And we're seeing it repeat all over again. The demand to defund the police is not coming from ordinary working class black Americans. It is not coming from the streets, as Dave Chappelle would like to claim. Dave Chappelle needs to get back on the streets if he's going to lecture the world about what the streets think and what the streets are doing, and these riots are from the streets. No, they're not. They're from criminal gangs, they're from Antifa, they're from criminal opportunists, and they're from young lefties. Some black young lefties, too, that are upper middle class with professional class degrees, like the man involved in trying to firebomb police cars in New York. But it ain't coming from blue-collar America. It ain't coming from the black barbershop. It ain't coming from the black church. It ain't coming from the black business. It's coming from upper-middle-class whites who want to restructure society in the name of whatever ideology is popular and cultish with them at the moment. Working-class people overwhelmingly oppose this. Anyone over 45 overwhelmingly opposes this. So if you factor out self-described liberal post-college degree folks, then you're getting almost 80% opposition amongst almost any other group in the country, including African Americans. So that's what the polling data really shows. The polling titles opposition to defending police amongst most demographic groups. That's because overwhelmingly Americans oppose that idea, period. But it's particularly strong amongst everyone except one little group that supports it. One little group of young, white, lefty, upper middle class kids. That's basically it. And that's what flipped the civil rights movement in the late 60s to a pro-law enforcement movement by the early 70s. We went from the peak of liberal power from 1932 to 1964. Liberalism and Democratic Party dominated the United States overwhelmingly. 1964 was its peak of power. By 1968, we had brought about a Republican conservative counter-revolution that would consume culture, that would consume politics for the next quarter century easy. That's when we get Dirty Harry, Clint Eastwood movies. That's when we get Charlie Bronson, Death Wish, and Vengeance movies. Just go back and watch a lot of the films that were popular in the 70s that don't even exist in the 60s or 50s, that are reflective of the cultural transformation taking place. The last issue, but last but not least issue for us to discuss tonight, is the issues concerning the Supreme Court's decision, which has rocked the conservative world. And I think unnecessarily so. So to give you some takeaways for example, there was an article written before the opinion by Thomas Roast in the Washington Post called "I Did What Was Best for My Business." Well, the Supreme Court punished me for it. And his was the most compelling case before the Supreme Court from a policy perspective, from if you were going to make a decision based on the policy outcome of the case, based on the political outcome of the case. This guy's case was the strongest to ignore the law and just make a different decision than the law might compel. Because he pointed out, he starts a funeral home, he wants people to dress in a conservative way because he doesn't want people who are mourning a tragic event to be thrown off by some politically weird behavior by the people at the funeral home. So he required women to dress like women and men to dress like men. Along the way, an individual decided that, now he was a little bit unusual. This was not just a random whim. This was someone who was seeking psychological treatment. He'd had problems with mental health issues. He'd had suicidal inclinations, etc. So this was a more sympathetic case than than some other circumstances might be. And his psychologist advised that he really thought of himself as a woman, so he should start to live as a woman. Now, I have some serious doubts about that psychological treatment, but we'll put that aside for the moment. That's what he's told, so that's what he tells his employer, where he's worked for some years. And that's the funeral home. And the funeral home's guy's like, well, I don't know how I can do that because my whole dress code is about not shaking people up. And if I have a guy dressed as a woman, I'm going to be shaking people up. So he said, I can't keep you if that's the case. You probably should seek employment elsewhere. He brought suit, and that was one of the 3 cases up at the U.S. Supreme Court. They joined a bunch of cases to decide the issue. Does discrimination, where you're not allowed to discrimination based on sex. Gender was the loose articulation, but that's not the actual words in the statute. The word just says discrimination based on sex. And you can't let sex be a factor at all. It's not a matter of whether or not it's the only factor or the predominant factor. If it's a factor at all, then you can be sued. That's a violation of the law. And so the question was, does that apply to these people where the discrimination was because of a dress code in the case of the funeral home issues, where he wasn't going to allow men to dress like women? And broadly interpreted, basically does discrimination based on someone's transgender status or gender identity status or them being gay, is that included in the statutory definition of prohibiting discrimination that is impacted by someone's sex? And so the decision ended up being 6-3. Judge Alito, Justice Thomas, and Justice Kavanaugh said, look, when the statute was passed, it did not include to protect gay people. It did not include to protect gender identity. It did not include to protect transgenders. And since there's no legislative history that was supported, there have been attempts to amend the statute to include it that failed. We should not rewrite the statute to include it. The key decision came, the four liberal justices, of course, all said we want to protect gay people, we want to protect transgenders, and to be frank, they increasingly are just outcome-oriented. They look at a case and they say, what outcome do I want? I'm going to manipulate the outcome to get what I want. And so it was very unsurprising to anyone that they decided that, the law, they wanted an outcome that said transgender and gay people are protected, so they would sign on to any decision that achieved that objective. So it came down to Justice Roberts and Justice Gorsuch. And Sean Trende at Real Clear Politics had predicted last year that this would become more of an issue. And in fact, the interpretation by Joel Pollack over at the legal writer for Breitbart notes that the Gorsuch decision in this case shows that religious freedom and LGBT rights can coexist constitutionally. Indeed, the way he puts it is that Gorsuch is sort of coming to a united opinion, and that, quote, Gorsuch is telling LGBT rights activists that the proper way for them forward is to advance their positions by asserting their rights as individuals under existing law, not to target the constitutionally protected rights of other people, like, bake my cake kind of cases. And the decision is that it was, and so he was saying he's actually forming a way that protects core constitutional liberties for everybody that will ultimately be beneficial to religious rights. Some of the concerns about the case was, is it now just open season for, can anybody just call themselves a woman and all of a sudden I as an employer have to deal with all these crazy things? Does it impact the religious discrimination cases? Does it impact the locker room? Does it impact bathrooms? There was a lot of panic in the reaction from people who did not read the decision. So I'm going to read through the decision and explain it for you, explain where it came from. I'll tell you up front, I believe Justice Gorsuch simply followed the law. Now, sometimes the law leads to a policy outcome you don't like. Sometimes the law leads to a political outcome that you don't like. But our justices should not be legislators. Our justices are not elected officials. They should simply follow the law. And if there's a problem with the law, we, the people, through our legislative branch, through our executive branch, through the constitutional amendment process, we, the people, can change it. But we should not want to be governed by a philosopher guardian, of philosopher kings, like something out of a Platonic novel, who are all going to be professional class members by definition because they're lawyers, and they're going to overwhelmingly lean liberal and anti-democratic in their orientation, anti the people in their orientation. We have the Supreme Court to thank for the Civil War because the Dred Scott decision was a ridiculous decision, particularly after the Amistad decision of 1840. We have the Supreme Court to thank for the rise of the Klan and for the civil rights oppression of black Americans from after the Civil War. We fought a civil war to stop it, passed a bunch of laws like the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the 1860s and 1870s to prevent it from reoccurring, to stop the Klan cops, Klan police, Klan banks, Klan businesses, Klan institutions. And then, of course, it was the Supreme Court in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson, that said segregation was just fine and racial oppression just okay. They refused to take any case that they dealt with that exposed the hypocrisy of the laws in the South for more than 60 years. So we have the Supreme Court to thank for the civil rights problems of the South from the 1890s to the 1950s. We have the Supreme Court to thank for bad laws about forced vaccinations. We have the Supreme Court to thank for the forced sterilizations of poor children all across the South in particular that led to 70,000 women being denied the ability to have their own children. That's thanks to the U.S. Supreme Court. We have the Supreme Court to thank for saying that a company could not restrict a government could not restrict how much child labor a 6-year-old kid did. The degree to which the New Deal resulted in what it resulted in that some people have problems with, they can thank the Supreme Court for making excessive rulings about the interpretation of the so-called right to contract. And they're opposing the basic rights of labor unions for about 30 years. That precipitated more labor violence in that context than would have occurred had the Supreme Court simply honored its constitutional obligation and not imposed its political and philosophical views on the world. So we do not want the Supreme Court to give us policy outcomes. We do not want the Supreme Court to give us political outcomes. We want the Supreme Court to follow the law. And if we don't like where that law leads us, in a policy or political terms, it's up to us to get the legislature to change it, to get the constitutional amendment process where that's required to change it, to get the executive branch to enforce it in a different manner. That is up to us. That's up to our elected officials and us putting pressure on them. We do not want justices replacing those people. So Gorsuch follows the law, and here's how he outlines the case. The title of the case, the lead case, because remember it's a combination of 3 different cases, is Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia. So it was argued all the way back in October. The decision was issued today. They'll have some more decisions issued later in the week. Unfortunately, they decided to dodge the issue of qualified immunity. That's where various police officers and government officials are treated like they're the employed by God, effectively. That's where the idea of sovereign immunity derives from. And they are held immune from things like the Eighth Circuit did just last year in a case that's just like the George Floyd case that said the police officer could do what he did without even being sued civilly. You want to know where the George Floyd problem came about? It came about because the Eighth Circuit let it come about. Not just because of Democratic politicians, though they're the primary culprit, who let bad cops stay in positions of power and who covered up for them repeatedly and routinely over a 15-year time period, including Amy Klobuchar when she was a prosecutor in Minneapolis and Minnesota before she became a United States Senator, but she continued the trend as a United States Senator as well. The qualified immunity problem of police officers being immune solely because, well, nobody had committed that form of violence before, or nobody had ever sued for that before. So, a cop couldn't know that could possibly be wrong. That's the logic of a lot of qualified immunity cases. So I knew the Supreme Court was going to go that way and not dealing with qualified immunity this term, because I had had several Supreme Court petitions pending this term before them on precisely that question. A mentally ill person, involuntarily institutionalized solely to prevent him from causing harm to himself. And then they leave him alone in isolation in a room with a pair of scissors to do the exact harm he was institutionalized to prevent him from causing to himself. But according to the court, Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals and the federal court in Wisconsin, that's just fine. That's qualified immunity. They could have no idea that could possibly go bad. Why do we even have involuntary institutionalization if they have no duty or obligation to make sure the person doesn't do that which they're being involuntarily imprisoned to prevent them from doing under the mental health standard? Similarly, I had a case where a young girl went to a public park. The local community created a public park, used tax dollars to do it, helped get elected, promising to do it, created a pond, had lifeguards, had a little local beach, charged people on top. Not only that, used taxpayers' dollars and get elected by building this park, they then charged them extra money to even go in. And people thought it was supposed to be for working class families where they would be more affordable than other public parks, but added protections because it was a publicly created park, not a lake with who knows what in the land, who knows where the drop-offs are or anything like that, and with lifeguards present. And a little girl went and drowned. They only knew she drowned because somebody stepped on her. It turned out they had secret, undisclosed, massive drop-offs in the pond that they created. They called it the swimming pond, by the way. The lifeguard didn't know how to pay attention to certain basic information, failed to follow basic procedures for the kids' safety. But you know what the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals said? That's okay. That's all right. It's tough. You can't put these poor obligations on these poor governments. Yes, maybe they only got elected for that. Yes, people gave their hard-earned tax dollars to make it safe. Yes, people paid to be there that day to make it safe. Yeah, it's a little girl who died a horrific, tragic death. Yes, they did even follow their own safety procedures they promised the world they would follow. But golly gee, that's just qualified immunity. That's the logic of these courts. Well, the Floyd case happened because an Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals said a very similar neck restraint hold was just fine and was something within qualified immunity. Our courts have as much blood on their hands as anyone does. And that's why we don't want courts, where we do needed courts to get involved in qualified immunity, and unfortunately they turned down every single case today, over the wise dissent of Justice Thomas, who noted it was long overdue to recognize this was being excessively applied to create an immunity that neither the Constitution compelled nor statutes required. They decided not to do that, but they did rule on this employment case. But here it's good that they're not behaving like super philosopher kings, but are just enforcing the law. Sovereign immunity, by contrast, is a made-up doctrine by courts. It does not exist in most statutes. It's a made-up doctrine based on the idea that because the king is from God, he can do no wrong, period. So he can never be sued. He's constantly immune because he's God, and you can't sue God because God's perfect. Well, we are a democracy that overthrew that idea of government, and yet we still are stuck with it because a bunch of judges and justices wanted to protect their pals and friends in the political world. That's the reality. So, but turning back to the Bostock case, the Bostock v. Clayton County, Georgia case that was issued today. In each of the cases, as the court, I'll first read through the court opinion, then give you my explanation as to why. In each of these cases, an employer allegedly fired a longtime employee simply for being homosexual or transgender. Each employee sued, alleging sex discrimination under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As the core parts of the decision are outlined as follows. The parties concede that the term sex in 1964 referred to the biological distinctions between male and female. Now, that's important to note. So the court did not, as some people are saying, say that if you just ignore biology and say if you just considered yourself male or female, then that counts the same way. That's not it. There's a particular logical reason why they're saying if you as an employer are making a decision that you would not have made without considering the person's biological gender, then you're discriminating. They did not authorize anything beyond biological distinction. Indeed, they recognized it explicitly. Secondly, they note that an employer violates Title VII when it intentionally fires an individual employee based in part on sex. As the court notes, it makes no difference if other factors besides the plaintiff's sex contributed to the decision. Or it also does not matter if the employer treated both genders in the same way. A statutory violation of discrimination occurs if an employer intentionally relies in part on an individual employee's sex when deciding to discharge the employee. Discrimination on the basis of homosexuality or transgender status requires an employer to intentionally treat individual employees differently because of their sex. That's the key. They're not saying because someone's gay or because someone is transgender that means that they're covered under the statute. It means they were saying there's almost no conceivable way they can think of where that's a factor. If you say because he's a woman who likes a woman, or because it's she likes a woman, or because he likes a man, Gorsuch is saying, how can you make that decision without considering their biological gender? His point is that if what you're bothered by is their gay behavior, at some level you're considering their gender. And that he's like, you can't disconnect that. You can't disassociate that. So even if you're not discriminating against them because they're a man, you're discriminating against them because they're a man who likes another man. He says you're still making gender a factor in the decision. And he's like, you may dislike how the law was written, but that says that's illegal under the law. That's how it was written. It was very broad, very expansive, very inclusive. That's why it includes sexual harassment. That's why it includes same-sex sexual harassment. That's why it includes protecting young mothers, pregnant women. It protects all of them because inevitably gender is going to be a factor somewhere along there. And again, it can be just a tiny percentage. As long as it's a factor, the law is written, says that's the way it is. Don't like it? Go change the law. Lobby to change the law. But don't ask us, the justices, to do so because that's a dangerous, perilous path that's anti-democratic over time. As he pointed out, here's the key to his conclusion. An employer who discriminates on these grounds inescapably intends to rely on gender, biological gender, in its decision-making at some level. Because it's like the word gay, homosexual, has gender included within it. Transgender has gender included within it. So if you're making a decision based on either one of those factors, clearly gender is a factor. That's the point. In other words, what makes the funeral home owner not want to have the man dressed up as a woman may be separate from gender in general, but it's because it's a man dressing up as a woman that he has a problem. So the fact that he's a man is a factor, even if it's not the predominant factor. That's all Gorsuch is doing, is saying, look, I'm just reading the plain language of the statute. So whatever you think about it, whatever you like or dislike about it, this is how the law is written, and we should not be rewriting laws as justices. So that's why he says an employer who fires an individual for being homosexual or transgender fires that person for traits or actions it would not have questioned in members of a different gender. Thus, gender plays a necessary and undisguisable role in the decision. Title VII forbids that. It's like that's what the statute is. It says this is just applying the plain language of the statute to the plain facts. And it may lead to a public policy outcome you don't like. That's for legislators to change, not me as a Supreme Court justice. As he points out, if judges could add to, remodel, update, or detract from old statutory terms inspired only by extra-textual sources and our own justice imaginations, then we risk amending statutes outside the legislative process, and that is reserved for the people. We would deny the people the right to continue to rely on the law as crafted and passed to settle their rights and obligations. And the right of the people, if there's a problem, to go back in and get amendment if they want to, whether that's statutory amendment or where it involves a constitutional right, constitutional amendment. But leave that to the people. The people get to determine that. We as justices don't get to do that. We don't get to say, well, we don't think they meant that when they passed that law. No, because that's a slippery slope of all slippery slopes. That's no boundaries. That's no limits. That has no meaningful, effective restrictions that can guide us going forward. We just follow what you wrote. Just like a contract, it's what's in there. Now, maybe you didn't mean to put that in there. Maybe you had a different interpretation. Well, then put that in. You get to rewrite your contract, not us as courts. That's the point and purpose of sticking to the letter of the law, the language that's written by the people, not substituted in by the court. Indeed, as he points out, the statute's message is simple and momentous. An individual's homosexuality or transgender status cannot be relevant to employment decisions at any level because it inevitably and inescapably involves a judgment made on gender, biological gender. It's impossible to avoid. As he says, an employer who fires a transgender person who identified as a male at birth but who now identifies as a female is going to have to consider gender at some level because the word transgender doesn't mean anything unless you're considering the word gender also. And you can't consider gender under the law. That's how the law is written, right, wrong, or otherwise. That's what the law is written. You can't discriminate on these grounds because that requires an employer to intentionally treat individual employees differently because of their biological gender. So all he did was apply the logic of the law and the language of the law and the words that it was written in. If there's a political problem with that, go back and change it. Indeed, he points out that try writing out instructions for who should check a box without of either homosexual or transgender without ever using the words man, woman, or gender. He said it can't be done. That's his point. It includes the word gay includes gender within it. The word, if you say someone is gay, it means nothing unless the word gender is implicitly included within it, their biological gender. Transgender means nothing unless their gender identity is part of that, their biological gender identity. So that's his point. It's like if you're going to discriminate on that basis, you're discriminating based on some gender condition. As he points out, the reason for this, he's like, look, I understand there's a bunch of public policy objections, a bunch of objections on what the legislative history might have intended different than what it says. And here's what he reminds everybody. This court has explained many times over many years that when the meaning of the statute's term is plain, our job is at an end. The people are entitled to rely on the law as written, without fearing that courts might disregard its plain terms based on some extra textual considerations. Legislative history, for those who take it into account, is meant to clear up ambiguity, not create ambiguity. So you can't be super legislators. You have to submit to the decision and the laws as written. Now, critically, so I think the Gorsuch decision is simply following the law, even if people don't like the political consequences of it, even if people don't like the policy consequences of it. And I think it's the right constitutional approach. That's what we want our judges and justices doing. We do not want them being results-oriented jurists. In the same capacity, There was some fear-mongering about the decision that mistook what the decision was. So let me read from key parts of the decision that put those issues to rest. Under Title VII itself, the fear is that sex-segregated bathrooms, locker rooms, dress codes will prove completely unsustainable. None of those laws are before us. We have not had the benefit of adversarial testing about the meaning of their terms, and we do not prejudge any such question today. Under Title VII, we do not purport to address bathrooms. We do not purport to address locker rooms. We do not purport to address anything else of the kind. The only question before us is whether an employer who fires someone simply for being gay or transgender has legally discriminated against that individual based on that individual's sex, or whether they took that into consideration at any level. And because the term implicitly includes that within it, that's what the statute is written and how it applies. But does not deal with bathrooms, does not deal with locker rooms, does not deal with dress codes, does not, quote, deal with anything, any such question today. So the overreaction is just that. There are going to be some courts that go crazy. There are going to be some lower courts that misuse and abuse what this decision means. But people don't need to worry about that too much unless you're in a lefty jurisdiction where state law is already moving in that direction. Separately, employers fear that complying with Title VII's requirement in cases like ours may require some employers to violate their religious convictions. Here again, Justice Gorsuch notes that's not the case. Churches do not need to worry. Religious employers do not need to worry. Charities do not need to worry, and he explains why. Congress included an express statutory exception for religious organizations. This court has also recognized that the First Amendment can bar the application of employment discrimination laws to claims concerning the employment relationship between a religious institution and its minister. Congress has gone a step further yet. In the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, of 1993, and that statute prohibits the federal government from substantially burdening a person's exercise of religion unless it demonstrates that doing so both furthers a compelling government interest and represents the least restrictive means of furthering that interest. Because RFRA operates as a kind of super statute, displacing the normal operation of other federal laws, it might supersede Title VII's commands. So they point out that this should not impact or be perceived as impacting in any way religious institutions or religious liberties. And it's not a broad-scale, wholesale, include all transgenders, include all gay people, no matter what, no matter the circumstances, no matter whether it's a bathroom or a locker room or anything else. It is, or athletic contest, because that's about Title IX, not about Title VII. So it's not about schools. It's not about churches. It's not about every context of employment. It's just if you're firing someone because they're gay, if you're firing someone because they want to dress as the opposite gender, it's impossible to separate that decision from gender itself. And because of that, under the plain language of the law as written, which can be easily amended by Congress, then that's discrimination under the law. That's just the reality of the situation. So that's where the case really goes. And there's dissents by Alito, dissents with Justice Thomas joins. He sees it as legislation because he doesn't like the public policy outcome of the case. I understand that. But my view is we need to have justices stick to the plain language of the decisions, the plain language of the law, not try to be super legislators. Let the law lead us to the outcome. Don't let our outcome lead us to make up the law. That's why I think Gorsuch is right. And I think the decision is correct. And the public policy solution is legislative amendment and change. Thanks for joining us for another edition of American Countdown. We'll be back tomorrow to discuss more of the pandemic insanity. And remember, the best way to protect liberty and freedom is to stick to the law, stick to the facts, stick to the data, stick to the science. And where there needs to be reform, the reform doesn't necessitate a revolution. The reform simply necessitates a return to original principles, a return to the true power to the people, not power over the people, but power to the people through democratic institutions and democratic controls and democratic checks. So that's what the Paul Revere's ride was all about. That's what our First Amendment is all about. That's what our Constitution is all about. And so let's stick to that and keep to that, because that guidepost of our Constitution is the best direction for governing we've ever had in the history of humanity. Thank you, and see you next time.
When do you think the people should be able to like talk again? The D person.
Yeah. That's a good question. Well, Alex Jones at least has Infowars.com. He can do his own thing, and people go to that.
And Gavin's got a show still.
Does he?
Yeah. You know, as someone who's kind of all for free speech, I often get told that I'm bad because I have to defend people whose language I don't agree with. That is what free speech is. It's not defending everyone who says things that I love.
It doesn't make any sense, because that means you're right all the time. Like, if you're only defending the things that you believe in, you right all the time about everything?
But I have to defend the people who say things that are even atrocious and that I would never get on board with, because that's what free speech is. Otherwise, yes. And like you said, it is that slippery slope of who gets to be the arbiter of what is said.
Right. And what are your guidelines? Alex Jones is funnier than Andy Kaufman's ever been. Alex Jones is f***ing hilarious often.
Did you see the whole that he's Bill Hicks?
Yeah. No.
Conspiracy?
That's not real.
I went down that rabbit hole.
That's the silliest shit ever.
I know, but there are videos.
But he had one thing about talking about, like, if it's between his family starving or eating his neighbor. He's like, I'll eat your ass. So it became this, come on.
I will eat your ass.
Do you don't think there's an entertainment value in him saying he's going to eat his neighbor?
It's on my dumpster fire.
Right. But there's something to that, like to stop that and ban that. You're not stopping anyone from you're not stopping anybody from anything bad by not having Alex do this entertaining thing about eating his neighbor. You're not saving anybody.
Yeah. You
know what I'm saying? Like, you gotta, like, what are you doing? Like, what is he doing that's so awful?
I don't know how to fix any of it.
It's entertaining. Like, why is it only acceptable if you have some kind of entertainment? Because there's so many rap videos that you could watch that I enjoy, but they're talking about shooting people and robbing people, and it's everywhere on YouTube.
Yeah.
It's so prevalent.
Yeah.
And somehow or another, that's okay. Like, it's f***ing weird what's allowed and what's not allowed.
I will eat your leftist ass like corn on the cob. I'm ready. I will eat your ass. I will eat your leftist ass like corn on the cob. I'm ready. I will eat you. I will eat your ass. My children aren't going hungry. I'll do it. I'll drink your blood. And I'm starting to think about having to eat my neighbors. You think I like sizing up? I'm gonna haul him up that chain. Chop his ass up, size it up. I'm gonna haul him up that chain. Chop, 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 chop. Barbecue your ass flat. I will cook your ass up so fast, and I'll tell him, I killed a cow out back, baby. You think Christ would eat somebody? He would never do that. I will. I'm ready to hang them up, gut them and skin them and chop them up. You know what? I'm ready. I will eat your leftist ass like corn on the cob. I'm ready. I will eat your ass. I will eat your leftist ass like corn on the cob. I'm ready. I will eat you. I will eat your ass. That's why I want the globalists to know. I will eat your ass first. I swear to God, if it's the last thing I do, I'm gonna get my hands around your throat.
Hey guys, Rob Dew here with InfoWarsStore.com, and I want to tell you about something that I think has really helped me out, and I think can help you out too, especially if you have any problems sleeping, and that's Knockout. Let's face it, our life patterns have been disrupted by this lockdown, this government-imposed imprisonment, and it has definitely affected my sleep schedule. But one thing that has helped is Knockout. I take one pill about an hour before I want to go to bed, and boom, I get a great night's sleep. And just this past Memorial Day, I took 2 of them, fell asleep about 1 a.m., woke up at 8 a.m., ready to go. It really has made a difference in my life, and it can make a difference in your life too. If you don't get any sleep, you're going to be a grouch. If you get great sleep, you're going to be on point. You're going to be mentally focused. You're going to be ready to take on the day. And right now, Knockout is 50% off. It's less than $15 a bottle. You get 30 capsules. Give it a try today. It's at a great price right now, and it can really help you get the sleep you need, especially in these tough times. It's Knockout, and it's available at InfoWarsStore.com.
This is your emergency broadcast system announcing the commencement of the annual purge. At the siren, all crime, including murder, will be legal for 12 hours. Your government thanks you for your participation.
We played a lot of purge games this evening. We have just one more. It's called Mommy's Choice. Which one of you will survive this year's purge?
The soul of our country is at stake. The purge targets the poor and the innocent.
Blessed be America for letting us purge and cleanse our souls. Join me as we eliminate evil. Purge and purify.
It's finally here. Introducing the new Survival Shield X2 spray. Available now for 33% off at InfoWarsStore.com. Listeners have been asking us for months to develop an iodine spray made with our exclusive Deep Earth Crystal Nascent Iodine. Our proprietary new Aerodyne technology allows us to harness the full power of ancient iodine crystals from 7,000 feet below the Earth's surface into the ultimate spray formula. Iodine is an essential mineral that helps support thyroid health, healthy metabolism, and healthy cognitive function. Get the new Survival Shield X2 spray for 33% off intro pricing at InfoWarsStore.com. That's Survival Shield X2 spray at InfoWarsStore.com.